mostly on for 8 years, and the last month or two really crazy, I think, going crazy with it. So we want to hear about that. I think that's about it. A reminder of next week, Tuesday and Wednesday, starting at 6:30, except there will be a slight welcome, and then we'll start with the candidates. I believe you can go on on our website, our Facebook page to watch it live, or you can be one of the Zoom people. You need to request the Zoom number for that, I guess. Is that correct, I think? So anyway, that's next week. I think we have almost all of the local candidates are going to be there, if I'm correct. And many of the state, there are a few that will not be. We do have to go by the state rules that if one person cannot show up, the other person cannot speak, cannot answer questions. Unfortunately, that's a league rule. Evidently goes with the FCC, the FEC, and the IRS. And we don't want to be in trouble with any of those agencies, that's for sure. So that's going to be next week, 6:30 Thursday, Tuesday, Wednesday nights, and then they will be on our Facebook page and etc. to be able to watch later. So at that, again, I welcome all of you, and John, we'll let you take that away. Thank you very much for being here and being there with us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Mary. Quick question. How much time do we have?
I think we need to be done by 8:30 at the very latest. So that's an hour and a half.
Well, then I will be respectful of your time, and I'll go through parts of this. And I'll tell you what, if people have questions as we go, this is such a complex equation. I'd rather answer the questions as we move through this as opposed to waiting till the end.
Okay,
if that's okay.
Fine. If you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and we can call on you to do that.
Right, just interrupt. I'm at the office now. There's nobody around, so we have plenty of time to go through this. Okay? All right. So your first question was about open enrollment, especially when it comes to ed choice vouchers and such, and how that impacts a local school district. And keep in mind that this has been a contentious topic for quite some time. We were paralyzed a few months ago with the attempt by some in the Senate to expand the ed choice vouchers. And you need to know how this works in order to appreciate the pushback that has been historically the case from our public schools. So the choice program goes back a couple of decades. It was funded a few $1 million at first, but it has exploded and has creeped into conversations and intense disagreements around the state. So essentially, the problem is not with choice. I would say, a legislator would appreciate the fact that the parents, some would prefer to homeschool, some would prefer to send their students to parochial school, some would prefer to send them to a community school. That's not the issue. The real issue keep in mind that the school funding plan is only about finances, period. We didn't get into the policy matter of should there be community schools or not. We started from the premise that that decision has already been made, but we can correct the issues as they impact public schools. So here's what happens. Essentially, there are two overarching scholarship, if you will, or figures that are used. The elementary kids who choose to take advantage of either an ed choice voucher or what you could call an economically disadvantaged voucher, that amounts to about $4,000. High school students, it's about 60-20. That's the base cost. They get the entire, and this is important to understand, they get the entire amount because those districts, if you want to call them that, are not allowed to raise taxes as a normal public school district can, either through property taxes, levies as you would know it, or an income tax, such as what Geneva did recently. They're not allowed to tax, so the state, the policy is they get the full amount of what the average per pupil amount is. Now, here's the problem though. As a student leaves, and I'll just throw out some examples. Say a student leaves Geneva High School for a community school, or opts out on a voucher of some sort. That student is entitled to take with them $6,020. And here's the problem. When I say take with them, if Geneva's state share, in other words, what the state is going to give them, is only $3,000, that student not only takes that $3,000, but another $3,020 from the Geneva school to wherever he or she is going. That is called a deduct, which is short for deduction. But in education circles, you'll hear the term deduct used a lot. And that adds up to a lot of money over a period of time. When you have hundreds of these students who are potentially leaving, taking advantage of these vouchers, the state has not funded them separately. So think of the school as your local public school as a pass-through entity. And as those dollars add up, local tax dollars are essentially following that student to wherever he or she is going. And that is a major bone of contention, especially when state budgets have been cut and we've been stuck at 60-20 for 3 years now. That has not been adjusted for inflation. And it puts a lot of pressure on school districts to make difficult choices. That money must follow the student. So if that's the case, and you have to cut certain programs in order to balance the budget, and keep in mind, a school district must operate a balanced budget. Unlike the federal government, they can't print money, they can't borrow money. There's a real penalty to be paid at the local level for these students who are leaving. And the problem has been all along, the state has supported lip service, I should say, to this concept of choice, but not permitted, the state has dragged its feet in terms of actually funding that. In our fair school funding formula, here's a major difference. There would be no deductions, no deducts. The state would fund these children fully at that particular cost, and I'll get into that later, how that was arrived at, without passing through the local school districts. And that alone will save the district money. So go back to our hypothetical example there of Geneva. All that locally raised millage through property taxes and income, in the case of Geneva, will then stay in the district and will not follow the student, because the state will be, in effect, paying the full freight for that particular choice. So that is a major reason why public school districts support, one of many major reasons why they support this fair school funding plan. So that's a quick thumbnail sketch about vouchers and ed choice. And that would apply to, and I know there was some heartburn in Ashtabula County earlier this year. Ashtabula City School losing students to, say, St. John was going to really make an impact on Ashtabula City's budget. And of course, again, we believe in choice, especially ed choice, and there are some incongruities on other terms. And Jessica, you'll appreciate this when we use the term choice. For some, it's a selective term and not necessarily across the board. But my argument's always been, for the state, if you really agree to choice, then the state ought to come up with the funding for it. So I'll take questions on that particular issue before we get into this whole notion of school funding. And I think that would be the best way to handle it, Mary.
I have a question. Are there any schools in our county who have this new ed choice? I mean, it's not every school, isn't it? Isn't this the schools that are considered troubled schools or something?
Well, yes, and that's where the state testing comes in. They're not performing as well as they could, and that triggers, of course, the option, and that's why I mentioned Ashtabula City. And Mary, I'm glad you brought that up, because I've been working for the last 3 or 4 years with Ashtabula City for the wraparound services to meet the mental and social and emotional needs of those students. If any of you have ever, and I'm going to give you a term to look up, you can Google this. It's called the Euler model, O-Y-L-E-R, O-Y-L-E-R, Euler School in Cincinnati. And I want to mention that for a bit, and then I'll come back to Ashtabula City, and then Mary, I'll answer your question. We're going to go down a rabbit hole for just a moment. This school in Cincinnati has been the subject of a lot of interest recently because it is in the Price Hill region. And it literally, and I have been there we made a caravan a few years ago to see what was up here. It is a very poor area of Cincinnati, down near the river. And a few years ago, in their school, and it was K-8 at the time, the high school was literally up on top of the hill. And none of those students who went to this Euler school graduated from high school. 0. And it was appalling what had happened. There was a disconnect between leaving this little protected area and graduating from the local high school. So what they did to help those students was to bring in mental health services, dental work, dentists, optometrists, counseling right into the school, so that those students would have those services available to them when they were in school, and then after school hours or on weekends or during the summer, it was open to the community. So community members wouldn't have to travel. They could actually receive the same services, dental, vision, etc., within the confines of the school. And all the school did was provide them a framework, an area without overhead for those professionals to work. Here's the amazing thing. Over a period of time, their graduation rate increased to over 80%. Because once these kids had those kinds of supports, they then could function as normal students, and education became appealing. And I can tell you this as a former teacher. If a student comes in with a toothache, and if a student, and I had this happen before, and Jessica, and I know you can relate to this, dog died. First death that this student had ever encountered. It's a traumatic experience. You can't teach them anything unless think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, unless their needs are first met. That's the idea of Euler School. That's what we've been doing with Ashtabula City School. And as a result, then, we've been working with Superintendent Potts. They have a vision center set up. They have mental health counseling there. We've been working with the dental. And I'll give you an example just locally. It was discovered that a handful of students in 3rd grade were on an IEP, an individual education plan, and deemed to be in a special track. They were having learning difficulties. Come to find out, they were essentially blind. Nobody had actually taken them to a doctor or had even considered doing that because it was out of county or they didn't have the money. And these students, once they were fitted for eyewear, were able to not only catch up, but to do quite well. And the point of the matter is, we don't know how many students fell into that category. And if a student can't hear, here's some real problems that break my heart. Some of you have heard the term couch surfing. They don't know where they're going to spend the night. We have in Toledo Public Schools 3,000 students, 3,000 in Toledo Public who are classified as homeless. How are you going to get an education if you're homeless? Point of the matter is, by these wraparound services being incorporated in the Ashtabula City School Districts, we're trying to address those issues so the students evaluated on their state tests, and I've got a bone to pick with those state tests that we send out a report card for, those students are doing better. As a result, Ashtabula City Schools are doing better. And then, Mary, to get back to your question, the idea is to lift them out of this zone so that those particular programs might not be applicable to them. I mean, Ashtabula City was in the next tier. You've heard of the state takeovers, the HB 70, where Youngstown City, Lorain City lost control of their district. The state actually took them over. Ashtabula City was close to that because of their report card scores for so many years. So we've been able to avoid and dodge that bullet. But again, my idea is to meet those kids and it is meet their needs where they are. As I've told Superintendent Potts and City Manager Timonier, and by the way, Jim Timonier went with us to the Oiler School to see what it was all about. As Ashtabula City Schools go, so goes Ashtabula, and as Ashtabula City goes, so goes our county. So it's important that if we want to talk about revitalizing Ashtabula County, and this was what I want to editorialize for a moment, if people want change to come to Ashtabula County and be a place where we're not bleeding our young kids elsewhere, we have to offer, especially today, when there are the options of working from home, a quality public education. People will move where the schools are good. And this is why I've spent so much time trying to work on this school funding plan. I was hoping to get it done in 4 years so that the remainder 4 years, I could work on the enormous task then of attracting and retaining high quality teachers so that students would be excited to come to school and find learning fun. Believe it or not, and I had some of your kids in school. Not only did we learn, but we had fun doing so. And the state tests were fairly easy because learning could be fun. It wasn't drudgery. But I'd like to stock our schools with those people who really want to be there, those people who are energetic, and then get out of their way and let them teach. So you can't get to that point without stabilizing a school's funding first, because, and I'll get into this, unless there's a stable stream of funding, schools will not be able to, or they won't be wish to offer programs that students find appealing and interesting and able to whet their appetite to come to school. And I'll do a deeper dive in that later. But the bottom line is school funding is important. And by prohibiting these deducts, it takes away the competition between the public schools and the charter schools and the parochial schools in terms of the vouchers. And everybody can play in the same sandbox with a great deal more of patience and understanding, because there are other issues that are clashing here as well, most notably with transportation, and we'll get into that for shortly here. Other questions?
Well, I still have my question. So there has been for a long time voucher programs for, say, I'll just be specific. Somebody from Jefferson wants to go to St. John. They
Yep.
get that paid for, correct?
Yes.
So
Yes.
the Ed Choice is a new program, and that's for schools that are not
Performing.
performing. I couldn't think of the word. Not
Yep.
performing. So that's different. Did they get more money for that?
No, same amount of money, but it still drains the public schools.
So why do they have that if you could always go to another school anyway? Why did they add this Ed Choice?
Well, I can only speculate.
Program.
Exactly. I mean, if the Howe kids, if your sons had wanted to go to St. John years ago, they could have.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I can only speculate that some of our parochial schools are in trouble financially. And this is a way through the back door of helping them out. Not in our area necessarily, but in other areas of the state. And keep in mind that as every book is really an autobiography, even though they aren't literally an autobiography, we write what we're interested in. So too is legislation an autobiography. And there are some of my colleagues who are products of and sympathetic to those types of schools, and as such, their legislation reflects it.
Okay. So the ed choice, though, is not really any different than what we've already had.
Correct. It's just on steroids now, and that further creates issues for our public schools.
Because they're getting more money?
Yes, the
Okay.
idea is to lower the threshold and then expand the amount of dollars that are theoretically put into this by the state. But again, because it's a pass-through with the local districts, it comes out of their hide, so to speak.
Okay. Does Shar have a question?
I do.
Okay.
Well, comments anyway. Just because I met John briefly at one point in time, but I don't think he would necessarily remember because of the context. But I worked at first as a teacher and then a reading specialist for Ashtabula City. And then the last 26 years of my 33-year career with them, I was a school psychologist. Okay. So I heard a lot about ed choice. I heard a lot about the ed choice expansion. I heard a lot about special ed because I was also assigned to St. John. So for the last 8 years of my career, I was also evaluating students, whether they were Ashtabulas, Buckeyes, Genevas, PV, Grand Valley, Conneaut, wherever they came from. I was evaluating children at St. John, and the pressure was really on me to make all of these kids special ed because it was additional money. And yes, money makes the world go round, okay? So there was quite a disparity sometimes of why parents chose to send their children to St. John. Sometimes they simply wanted small classes. Sometimes they wanted the curriculum that they had. Sometimes it was because there was a dispute with a teacher or administrator in whatever school they were coming from. Some of them, if I tried to look back at records, had been a month in this district, 2 months in that district. You know, there was a lot of volatility in the populations before they would land at St. John. So then they came out with this ed choice expansion, and kids flooded because they thought, maybe erroneously, that if they could say that their child was going to St. John, it didn't have a negative connotation on the expectations of what the child could or couldn't do. So a lot of parents were making the choice to go there, but they wanted somebody else to pay for it. It's expensive to go to St. John. You know, and we talk about people who have concerns about sending their children to college. And, you know, we're talking about expenses that are now in elementary school that are, you know, thousands and thousands of dollars. I don't even know how much it costs anymore to send kids there. Does that ring any bells with anybody?
I'm shifting you here because I need to, my phone was dying. I need to charge it. Sorry about that. I was in committee this afternoon.
This is Donna. I have a follow-up question. Yes, because I always thought when kids went to St. John's, I thought the parents had to pay tuition for that. In fact, I thought when my nephew went there, I thought his mom had to pay tuition. So am I understanding now that parents don't have to pay any tuition for St. John's?
No, most people do pay for St. John. It has to be
Okay.
paid somewhere along the way. But some people want to be able to assign the cost to somebody else, which is handy when there's a program called Ed Choice. And, you know, there's a point that if you happen to live in a certain neighborhood, in Ashtabula, it was kind of famous that Thurgood Marshall, which was the old Station Avenue Elementary, that was pretty inner city. You know, and I had done some work there briefly. I was in another building in our district where the socioeconomic status was really low. And, you know, I had parents that they couldn't help their children because the parents didn't know how to read. They didn't know how to write.
Okay.
And they would turn up at my classroom door and say, you know, I need you to help. Can you, what can you do? What does this note say? You sent something home, but I don't know what it says. And I couldn't ask anybody else. You know, so it was really sad. We have a whole system of pockets of people who early on were too ashamed to say anything.
Yeah.
And once they did start asking for help, I mean, there were kids that back when I was teaching, I had them come in after school and work extra with me. And I actually had, you know, parents that would sometimes sit in with their child,
That's right.
you know, and I kept trying to steer some parents to the adult basic education, that the old ABLE program that was at Kent State's library. But transportation for many of them was also an issue.
Yeah.
You know, so part of the issue that some parents at St. John don't think it's fair that there are those incomers who aren't paying their own way.
Oh, okay.
And yet, you know, so that there's some issues there too of who really belongs and who doesn't. If it were a public school, it's like whoever lives in your district, they're your kids.
Mm-hmm.
But there were extreme disparities, like across Ashtabula City for years. There were extreme disparities in the abilities, the talents, the support that parents could give their children, the experiences, you know, any of those things, the values they had for education. It varied extremely across the entire district. And we had schools who were in competition with each other for things, but, you know, it's like where I taught, I was lucky if I had one children come to kindergarten who'd held a pencil. I was lucky if I had a child who could recognize their name in print, never mind write their own name. And yet across town, we had a school where, boy, they didn't know what to do with the child who came in who didn't recognize his name. Maybe we ought to test him for special ed. You know, and it's like all but, you know, and I had classes with, I had 38 kids in one session and 34 in the other. You know, and they couldn't recognize a whole lot of things, and they just hadn't had those experiences. You know, and how do you compete? How do you measure apples and oranges? Because that's essentially what we were. They were along a different developmental track altogether just because of where they lived.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if is there, John, is there a difference between ed choice and open enrollment?
That's an excellent question. Yes, there is. The ed choice mostly has to do with parochial schools or community schools. Open enrollment is a whole different thing, where from one public school to another public school, kids can go. And that is another issue that has been hurting Ashtabula City. If you talk to the treasurer there, they lose a lot, and it's same sort of thing. If the state share is different from one district to another, that follows the student. Ashtabula City has lost to Buckeye, Geneva, Jefferson, and that has further drained their treasury, if you will. And quite frankly, too, those kids whose parents are more motivated or take education more seriously will sometimes opt to move their children out. And what is then left is, in general terms, those who may not be as educationally aware as others. And then we wonder why the test scores are so low. So yes, Jessica, there is a difference. And we've addressed that in our school funding plan too.
Is the amount similar? I was curious too, because I mean, I'm one of those strange people who I live in Buckeye and I open enroll in Ashtabula City, my girls. And
Ah, you
yeah,
are strange,
I
but
am
that's a good
strange.
strange. Thank
I
you.
know it. Well, I see a lot of promise, and I also see a lot of things that I value. I see more diversity, and just things
Yes.
I want my children to be exposed to, and I think it's good for them too. But so I'm just wondering if what the equation's about the same as far as the amount.
Okay, so the amount for the ed choice is 60/20. That's what the average statewide base cost is. And that's the guidelines we use. But let's say that, let's see, you're going from Buckeye. Buckeye's a wealthier district, and I'm just shooting from the hip. They're going to get less help from the state, which means that in Ashtabula City will get more. When it comes time to balance that out, I would assume that Ashtabula City would welcome those students from Buckeye because more dollars would be following them. And it depends, Jessica. Each district is different. It depends on their state and local share as to how that washes out with respect to open enrollment, which is different than the Ed Choice voucher. Does that make sense?
It does. I appreciate it. There's just been a lot of in my own head too. And I mean, and this is maybe something you'll get to, and I don't want to kind of commandeer this, but the other thing is homeschooling and what happens to funding it when people choose, because right now we're going through this pandemic and a lot of folks don't like this remote education. But you know, if you pull your child out completely, there is ramifications for the public system, right?
That's right.
Okay, and big ramification potential there, I would think.
Yes. Last I knew, Jefferson, for example, was looking at about a quarter of their students being educated at home. And it may have not quite reached that, but keep in mind when we do the student enrollment count, or the ADM, the average daily membership, that's what the funding source is based upon for a school. So if you lose your student body, a large chunk of them, to homeschool, then it's going to impact the funding formula from the state. And that's going to be a problem. Absolutely correct. Other questions about this before I dive right into the school funding formula, which will address and solve a lot of these questions? All right then. How many of you have heard of the DeRolf decisions? There were 4 of them. I assume all of you would be, right? Nathan DeRolf was a student at Perry Schools, actually Northern Local in Perry County back in the 90s, and it was determined that the way we fund schools in Ohio is unconstitutional. And there were 2 components of that particular case. One was the fact that we were not funding construction fairly throughout the state. And as a result, the tobacco settlement money was earmarked in a complicated formula to help districts with new facilities. And as you look around Ashtabula County, we have been the recipients of a lot of state aid to build new schools. And in some cases, in Jefferson, my home district is a good example. Every building is new, and including the board office. And the equation that was used was about 2/3 state money, 1/3 local money, and it's worked out quite well. So statewide, there are some districts that are still in the waiting list for money for new schools or for major renovations. We've addressed that component of DeRolf. The other side of DeRolf, though, was the notion that the way that we determined our state share and local share was unconstitutional because it was weighted especially hard on property taxes. Now, keep in mind that according to the Ohio Constitution, This is a shared partnership between the state government and the local government. And people have asked, well, in this fair school funding, will local levies disappear? The answer is no, because constitutionally it can't. There has to be a local effort. The other component that compounds this issue, and you'll hear local governments talk about this all the time, is HB 920, and that goes back to the 1970s. And it was since incorporated into a constitutional amendment. Local levies that are passed cannot be adjusted for inflation. So let's say Conneaut City Schools passes a levy that's going to generate $1 million based on property tax. Throughout the life of that levy, as more properties are built, more houses are built, more industry comes in, that dollar amount does not change. It stays constant, which means your share, my share, if we lived in Conneaut, would diminish. And throughout the life of that particular issue, there's no adjustment made for inflation. So after a period of time, the school must seek new money, which means a new levy, a new operating levy must be put on the ballot. And here's the reason for that. Back in the 1970s, and some of you who are my age can appreciate this, let me use a fictitious example. There was a couple when I was in high school who were recently married, and her name was Pat and his name was Terry. Sept. I'm just going to use that, pull that right out of the air and use that as an example. They lived above the florist shop in Jefferson for a while, and I can attest to that. And probably when they went out looking for their first house, those of you who can remember this, home loans were in double digits, 12%, 15%, just for a home loan. My first automobile that I bought, I paid 21% interest, and I was just ecstatic when I refinanced at a local bank and only paid 18% interest. So what we had was a runaway period of interest at the time. Home prices were ballooning, and the property taxes as a result were increasing so fast that the state legislature decided to put a cap on it. And instead of maybe putting a cap at 1% growth per year or 1.5% per year, they said 0% growth. And that's what has complicated this issue, that levies cannot adjust for inflation naturally. And so the school or your local government for a light levy or a road or bridge or a cemetery levy, when they need new dollars, they have to go back to the voters for new money. And that's something that I wished I could have addressed, but that would take a constitutional amendment, which is an incredibly heavy lift. So keep in mind that lurks in the background of what we're doing with school funding. The fact that school districts cannot come up easily with additional money with respect to inflation unless they put new levies on the ballot. So with all that being said, I want to get into this whole notion of the school funding plan that we have proposed, better known as HB 305. So if you were going to fund schools, you'd want to know really how much it costs to educate a kid. Wouldn't that be a good place to start? Well, before this time, that had never been arrived at. And so we had a group of individuals, superintendents and treasurers from around the state, 8 different subgroups who were assigned specific tasks. And one of the groups, the base cost group, was able to determine what it costs to educate a typical kid in a typical town. And here's how we did this. And it's all justifiable. We came up with and if you go to the website, Fair School Funding, you'll be able to pull this down. But we were able to determine, for example, the most important component of a child's education is the classroom teacher. So we started what research says is the preferred pupil-teacher ratio. So research says in kindergarten, it's 20-1. First grade to third grade, it's 23-1. Fourth grade on up to eighth grade, it's 25-1. In high school, it's 27-1. So the idea is that if a school district had, let's say, 57 students in kindergarten, and they are funded at a 20-1 ratio, then that school ought to receive funding for 2.9 teachers. Now, we all know that there's no 0.9 worth of a teacher, but that's what the funding level should be. This school funding proposal with respect to base cost is not prescriptive, meaning that the school district could opt to fund 57 students and actually create 3 classes as opposed to 2. Or if you had 2 very talented teachers, you could run a ratio of 30-1 essentially, and use that 0.9 somewhere else. So throughout every grade level, the funding for each group of teachers would be different according to the number of students in those schools who don't need special education supports, who don't need other things like English language learners. We'll get into that shortly too. This is just base cost. Substitute teachers, art, music, and gym, all included in this base cost because we felt it was important to include those specials that have typically been cut and casualties when school districts have been forced to make difficult choices. 60% of the base cost goes to direct classroom instruction. The next 15% goes to instructional and student supports. We know that we need high school guidance. We know that we need a library. We know that we need a media specialist. We know that there's instructional technology. And that is determined per pupil. They were able to get some numbers statewide and come up with average. Now let me backtrack for a moment. When I say funding for each of these teachers, we took the average salary statewide, average benefits statewide, and that became the number that we would use. And this will fluctuate from year to year as contracts come and increases are readily apparent. So it's fluid is what I'm saying. Average cost per teacher, salary, and fringe benefits. So 60% direct classroom, 15% instructional and student supports. Wait, there's more. 20% building leadership. We know what it costs to run a building. You have to clean it. You have to maintain it. And there's a complex formula per square foot at what each district would need to run its building. You have to have a principal. You might need support staff for the principal. That is all costed out in this base cost formula. And then finally, district-wide, the remainder 5%, you need a superintendent, you need a treasurer. There's an EMIS coordinator. Now the EMIS person has Educational Management Information System is what that stands for. This is a person that records all the daily attendance, the test scores, all the record keeping with respect to computers. It's a full-time job. State has never funded that before. We would be funding it in the base cost model. Point of the matter is, you start with the base cost because we need to know what it costs to educate a student to begin with. So I want to stop there for a moment. Any questions about base cost?
John, does it include a nurse?
Yes, yes. It also includes school security. District could use for metal detectors. It could use for a school resource officer. And that's why a couple of years ago, I worked with Frank Hall out of Chardon to with House Bill 318, define the mission of and the training for school resource officers, because those were not anywhere in the Ohio Revised Code. And we wanted to fund them, but before we could fund a school resource officer, we needed to know what we were talking about and what that would look like. And so with an eye to the future, Representative LaTourette and I were able to get that passed. And I, in the back of my mind, knew that this would account for that. So school nurses and the wraparound services, all here in the base cost. Excellent question. Other questions? Oh, athletics are included in here too, like athletic director, coaches and such. Again, it's a per student amount, average statewide.
Do you have union support? How do the teachers unions feel about this?
OEA and OFT are on board with this.
Okay, good.
Yep. So that's just the base cost. There's more. Are we ready to go on? All right. So once you have the base cost, there are two major components of this. If we know what it costs, then we have to figure out what is the fair local share and what is the fair state share. And this is sometimes called in educational circles, the distribution formula. So remember I said DeRolf was overly dependent on property taxes. Well, what we've done here in this proposal is to take a blend of property and income wealth to determine a district's capacity, and that's the term we use, capacity to generate local revenue. So in the state of Ohio, we actually have more income wealth than we do property wealth. And I forget what the number is, but it's essentially, if you add up all of our property wealth and all of our income in Ohio, 60% of it is based on income. We have essentially 2/3 of our wealth is income wealth, and the other third is property wealth. So what was determined by the financial group that dealt with the distribution, this other subgroup, and we had some real experts here. One fellow had worked for the Ohio Department of Taxation for 20 some years before he became a treasurer at a local district, so he saw both sides of it. So in terms of the capacity, 60% is determined by a district's property wealth, and the other 40% is determined by a district's income wealth, and we can determine that income wealth by the federal adjusted gross income that's measured on, and this is publicly available for districts through the federal tax returns. So by knowing what the average income is, that forms 20% of the income determinant overall. The other 20% comes from the median income of the districts. Then the other 60% comes, of course, from property. Now you might ask, well, why do we have average? Why do we have median? Because in some districts, we tried to be fair all the way through. Consider yourself a district, say Rio Grande, and there's a family named, I'm just going to make up a fictitious name, Bob Evans. The Bob Evans family of Rio Grande, Ohio. And that family decides to sell out everything to McDonald's Corporation. That one family in a small district could really skew an average wealth that is not really fair. So by taking the average and taking the median, we come up with a flattened curve to determine the wealth. Now let me pause here and give you an example. Some districts in Ohio are property wealthy and income poor, and other districts are income wealthy and property poor. True example here, Adams County down along the Ohio River, Manchester local district, a couple of years ago testified in the subcommittee, primary secondary subcommittee. Not one, but two coal-fired power plants were shutting down. Two of them. Now imagine two coal-fired plants in any of our districts. For that district, which was overly dependent on the property taxes generated by those two coal-fired plants, they were looking to put before their voters a levy of 130 mills. 130 mills. Preposterous. We had to juggle the formula to move more money into that district to cover the costs. That's an example. In the treasurer or superintendent, I forget which one spoke to us, asked us point blank, how many trailer parks do you want us to tax at 130 mills? Because keep in mind, the residential areas that would be evident within eyesight of two coal-fired power plants. It was just a tragic example. That's the extreme, but the issue is we wanted to get a snapshot of what a district's real capacity is between property wealth and income wealth. So once that is done, once we know the number of students, once we know what the wealth is, or what the capacity is, there's another formula then, and it gets quite specific here to determine how that district falls in a bell curve. The average effort in Ohio is, and every district has to have a 20 mil floor. You have to have 20 mils on the books. But the difference is, and here's where the heartburn comes in, 1 mil in, say, Athens County will generate, and I know this to be true, Trimble local schools, 1 mil generates $50,000. 1 mil in, say, Upper Arlington can be several $100,000. So the average effort is 2.25 mils throughout the state of Ohio. And the idea is that districts should approach that average. But if they're unable to, because their wealth is not adequate, then it would be the state that would backfill that money so that the equity would be achieved. If a district is unable, not unwilling, there's a difference, unable to generate wealth, then the state will help them out additionally so that the equity is achieved. There are some districts, in fact, there are some, and I represent one in Geauga County, and Treasurer has freely admitted that the ability is there, but the will to support their students is not. And those districts won't get help by this formula because it's got to be fair, it's got to be mathematically computed, and as such, it requires districts to do their fair share. So think of what we had thus far in simplistic terms. If we know what the base cost is, if we know what a district's capacity is and how it measures against the state average, then the state would backfill in the difference and have a formula that is equitable, transparent, and sustainable. Now, this is before the add-ons, and I'm going to pause here before I get into the other components of this formula. Jessica, are you still with me there? This is a lot to take in. All right.
Notes. I got all sorts of notes. It is a lot.
And we're just getting started. Questions, that's why I asked you up front how long we had. Questions for me at this point? All right then. Well,
How, John?
Yeah.
How receptive are your the other members of the Congress are to all this?
It's an excellent question. Is this Lorna?
Yeah.
Recognize your voice. All right. There are 99 members in the Ohio House. In the as introduced version of 305, 66 of them have already signed on as co-sponsors. And then when you add in then Representative, now Speaker, Bob Cupp and I, you get 68. We don't know what the Senate is because this is being initiated in the House, but we have been reaching out individually to senators to gauge their support in it. And our mission is to have a companion bill run through the Senate at the same time that this one's going through the House, so that we can beat the clock, so to speak, before this General Assembly concludes in December. So the support is there. And to piggyback on Jessica's question, OEA, OFT are in support. Chorus, which is the Coalition of Rural Appalachian Schools, is in support. My dear friend Bill Phillis, who has led the Equity Coalition, in support. There's another group of 70 schools in Greater Appalachia that's in support. The Big Eight the schools thus far are moving our direction. And they're waiting to see what the simulations are. We made some changes from the as introduced that will benefit them. And the three administrators, OPSI, BASA, and OSBA. In fact, I can tell you OASBO just last week, last Friday, unanimously passed a resolution in support of this. So we're moving in the right direction. There's a lot of support, but again, there's no money for this. And I've got to be upfront with you that this is only at this point a blueprint. And let me explain why that's important. You obviously know that revenues are down. There was a 300 million cut last fiscal year. There's a 300 million cut this year just in the education budget. In some way, if there hadn't been the COVID crisis, we would have been able to have funded this throughout. We were looking at a 4-year phase-in, and now we're looking at a 6-year phase-in, and it still can be funded. But here is why it's important. As I mentioned earlier, we have been stuck on $6,020 per student for 3 years now. Doesn't take into consideration inflation. And the problem is nobody knows how the state arrived at that number. It's really, it goes back to the Kasich administration, because there was no research done as to the cost of educating a student. So think of this as a blueprint. And here's the example I use. If you remember when you were young, first married, you want to save money for a car, want to save money for a house, college education for the kids, retirement, all those long-range plans. Well, nobody can afford those right up front. So all of us engaged in a budget where we incrementally would achieve these signposts, if you will, along the way, and phase in, if you will, a long-term plan. Well, that's what this essentially does. School districts are on board with it because they're trading off short-term financial pain for long-term fiscal certainty. And let me explain to you why that's important. And here's a story that I was going to use anecdotally. When we had budget cuts, and Lorna, you may have still been in the classroom, and I know Janet, you were, when the cuts came in the Kasich administration, if it wasn't tested, it was cut. And I'm looking at some schools, art, music, and gym, and Doug Grout, that pains me to say that, but things like mechanical drawing, engineering drawing, consumer science, FFA, cut down to the bare bones. So why is that important? Well, for some kids, those are the courses where they discover what their gifts might be. And I think that's important. If we want a workforce that is energized, if we want a workforce that is creative, shows up, contributes, then if we can match a student's gifts with their calling, they'll never seem to be working. I've never worked a day in my life, never. Because what I did in the classroom was fun, I enjoyed it, and oh yeah, I got paid. Now I know, Lorna, we could say, well, how much is enough? And you and I negotiated. That's a different story, but you can make a living. Likewise, this position I've been doing for the last 8 years, I've enjoyed because it's service to you guys and 115,000 other people like you. So why is it important for students to be able to match their gifts with their calling? Let me give you a personal example, and the first is painful. So it was the fall of my senior year at Jefferson, and those of you familiar with Jefferson High School remember there was a courtyard in the middle, and that's where the seniors could hang out. And this young principal, some guy by the name of Larry Braga, came down to my study hall first period, and he asked us boys, how many of you boys would be interested in taking a home ec class? Now, remember, it's fall of 1973. I'm a senior. I can finally go to the court. So can my brothers. How many hands do you think went up? 0. Because we were more interested in the court. And growing up in 1973, and I'm ashamed to admit this now, and Jessica, please forgive me. When we were getting married, let me put on my down by the river type attitude here. When we were getting married, we know who was doing the cooking in the house. Forgive me. Forgive me. It was a long time ago in a distant galaxy. So then he said the magic words. Remember, it's first period, and you get to eat whatever you make. Well, how many hands went up? They all did. And we had boys home ec, first class at Jefferson High School. And we made all kinds of things in there. But I quickly discovered that cooking is not one of my gifts at all. And to just verify this, and Janet, you can ask Nancy sometime. She left me home to babysit with the boys one night, and I was to make macaroni out of a box. Well, we played a little bit too long, and the boys were getting hungry. So I, and Doug Grout helped me out here, mathematically, I reasoned that if I increased the time, if I have the time and doubled the temperature, it would all work out well, right? Because I wanted to cut down the time, but the only way to do that was to increase the temperature. Needless to say, everything was burned. I quickly learned what the local pizza shop number was, so anytime that Nancy went out, I was in charge of ordering pizza for the boys. Not my gift, not at all. It's just something I still struggle with today in the kitchen. Same group of boys. Now it's senior year, second semester. Mr. Braga comes into our boys' home ec class. Gentlemen, he says, I want you to take personal typing. Now keep in mind, it's 1974. How many guys are typing? All the typing classes are filled with girls. It's not something that we want to do because after all, we're going to do real work, right? Then he said, I've looked at the roster and some of the cutest girls in school are in this first period class. How many hands went up? They all did. Point of the matter is, the skills I learned in that personal typing class are skills I use today. This very day I use. Jane Mead was my personal typing teacher, and I don't know how many times I thanked her or hugged her for teaching me those skills. Bottom line is, those kinds of courses, art, music, gym, drawing, those enrichment courses, schools have been reluctant to offer to students because we force, and Lorna, you'll appreciate this, schools to do a 5-year forecast, but the state only gives them a 2-year budget. Why do I mention this to you? The school districts are willing to forego a short-term budgetary hiccup because there isn't the money now in order to lay the foundation for a school funding plan that is predictable, that is accurate, that is transparent, that's sustainable for their future. It's that good. Now, there are other components of this school funding plan that I can get into that address open enrollment, special education, and ESCs, English language learners, technology, that sort of thing, if you would like. But I think at this point, I will take questions.
Yes, Mr. Patterson, Lou Baylog here. I have a question about smaller schools. Like, well, all schools have been really hit financially due to COVID and, having to have all these preparations and, what have you. But for smaller schools who seem to really be struggling financially, I think the HB 305 that you propose sounds very good. But when you look at Ledgemont closing, Newberry closing, and you're talking about a 6-year phase-in, what is do these smaller schools or schools really struggling financially have any other safety net that they can turn to maybe before this plan might come into place?
It's an excellent question. And keep in mind, I was a representative. I represent Ledgemont. There are 5 townships in Geauga County that are mine. And I took that one personally. What I was able to do with Ledgemont was to, if they agreed to, Ledgemont owed $2 million to the state at the time. And my fear was that the state was just going to come in and take them over. Was able to craft legislation that if Ledgemont agreed on their own to transfer or to merge or consolidate with another district, debt would be forgiven. And it was, and they went in with Berkshire. And then my next plan was to offer a change in the way that we construct school facilities so that if a district merged or consolidated or transferred with another, you would take the lowest local share. And in that case, it was Ledgemont's 80%. So if we're going to construct a new facility, it would start with the 80%. And then because they merged, there was another 25% added onto that. And then if they built it on a college campus, there was another 10%. Bottom line is the new building at Berkshire is a result of legislative work that I did with Representative La Tourette that reduced the local share there to 45%. So why do I mention that? Not only am I aware of the Ledgemont situation, also aware of Newberry. Newberry had, last I knew, an incoming kindergarten class of 20 students. And some of these districts, and I'm going to get into that issue here shortly, some of these districts are going to have struggles ahead given their size. It all comes down to the economy of scale. Now, what this does is provide a stable state share funding. If local districts want to do more on their own, they can. And that may be the case for some of these districts. Think of northern Trumbull County. There are some school districts in Northwest Ohio that we're declining student enrollment statewide. Our ADM has been headed down, and I don't know what the coronavirus is going to do, but because this formula is based on the number of students who are being educated, if you're losing students, you're going to get less state money. I can't justify it anywhere, anyways else other than that. But that is a concern. I believe in smaller class sizes, but I know there is a financial bottom line for districts that becomes very difficult when they get to be so small. Now, let me get into Newberry for a moment. And this was a case in Ledgemont. They were hurt by open enrollment. Before open enrollment, those districts would have been fine. But as that trend continued, and I think this still happens today, the bus from Madison actually came to the square in Ledgemont, in Thompson there, and picked up students. Newberry has bled kids to Berkshire, to Chardon, to West G, and there comes a point at which open enrollment sort of exacerbates a district's financial situation. So very sensitive to that. Again, districts have to make those tough decisions, but we are not producing as many kids as we used to. And that's just a factor statewide. Now, some districts are growing rapidly, but that's the exception, not the rule. Did that help answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thanks so much. And maybe one quick side thing. how about the Perry nuclear plant if HB6
Yes.
dissolves?
All right. Now, I know I took a lot of grief. I was in a box on HB6. My heart was heavy. That was the most difficult vote I've taken because I did not like the fact that some of our environmental standards were pulled back. But where the 200 people every day leave Ashtabula County and work at Perry plant, I couldn't absorb that hit. On top of that, when it's refueled, there are about 4,000 folks who come in and they fill our hotels. I talked to my city managers. The hit was going to be terrible for us. Plus, Perry and Davis-Besse contribute about $30 million every year to those districts. So that's what sometimes, and Bob Boggs, who used to represent as senator and a member of the House, this district, told me when I was first getting started, he said, John, there are some times you're going to take a vote and you're going to have to hold your nose and just do your best because there's no good way out of it. That's what I did on that bill. I had no idea what Householder was up to. So I do support the repeal, but we just can't repeal without replacing it with something else to provide relief for those school districts that may be losing something. And now we're going to get into energy policy here too. If First Energy wasn't upfront with us, and I did not serve on that committee, so I can't speak firsthand, but we needed to know exactly what their operating losses were. And there are more gas-fired plants coming along online. I just didn't feel that we could lose the nuclear option there to produce electricity, because if we want economic expansion, there's a need for continued power that's uninterrupted. And the downside of the gas is the fact that you have to frack. And if you have to frack, there's frack waste. In Ashtabula County, we have already 18 injection wells. So I wanted to, and this is why I do support, I was thrilled with the lead co just last week, the Icebreaker project. We need to do more with solar and wind, but that's all in the future. I can only vote in what things are now. So I did vote for House Bill 6, didn't like it, but I voted for the best interests of my district. And if once that is fixed, and that's why there's criticism that they're not going as quickly as they can. And some of my colleagues say repeal, repeal, repeal. Well, that's easy if you don't live close to one of those two plants. It's complex when you're talking about people's livelihoods and school districts and such. So the Speaker Cup is determined to repeal this, but also replace it with something that is fair for everybody without this pay-to-play drama that unfolded and ultimately cost the former speaker his position. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I was just, curious as to how it would affect, school funding, but you did answer that, so thank you.
Other questions? Well, I have a few more minutes if you're still interested. You want me to keep going? This is fascinating. It will keep you up at night as it does me.
Yeah, that's fine if you have more.
Yeah.
I do. The rest will be fairly easy. You'll hear a lot about targeted assistance. And because we're going from a formula that's more patches than it is formula, we would have to assist some of the districts that are going to be hurt. And I'll give you an example. If we agree, and one of the tenets of this formula is the funds will follow the students where they're taught, then open enrollment, and Jessica, this goes back to the open enrollment question, that becomes an issue. So Youngstown City Schools officially, currently, they enroll about 10,000 students. But 5,000 of those students are not educated in Youngstown City Schools. They're open enrolled, or they're taking advantage of vouchers or whatever. And if we were to all of a sudden pay them for the students they taught, we'd be moving from 10,000 students to 5,000 students. That district would implode. So transitional aid or targeted assistance will help ease those particular burdens, pumping more district than really what ought to be given to them in the short term until the formula is fully phased in. And I'll give you an example, and let's look at an open enrollment in that particular case. What we decided to do was that if a district meets these two criteria, and Youngstown does, and there's, I think, 40 districts around the state, most of them in former industrially heavy areas, steel manufacturing, Youngstown, Campbell, New Boston down in Portsmouth, Lima out in Western Ohio, that if there is 12% of the district's resident students who are leaving and their wealth index is above 1.6, they would get tier 3 targeted assistance. But in addition to that, we would count their students in their district of residence for this, calculating a district's targeted assistance rate. And then they would also be counted in their receiving districts where they're getting an education, and that school district would get the full rate that it would have earned from the state. So these students are actually being counted twice. The first in the district where they live, so that they're not losing terribly, but the receiving district then would pick up the targeted assistance rate of that student. So we've tried to level out this open enrollment, and that fix alone is a $68 million proposition in the formula. So that's critically important. Economically disadvantaged students, and this is, we get into what's called categorical aid, like categories, or they're sometimes called add-ons. We know that those students cost more money, and we've been woefully short on this. So we would increase this from $272 per student by $150 to $422. And this alone would add several $100 million statewide to those students. Studies indicate it could be as high as 60% more per student that economically disadvantaged students need in order to overcome some of those hurdles. We're introducing essentially what would amount to a 30% of the per pupil amount until research could be conducted in Ohio to determine what the exact cost is. And as a result, there's some big money in economically disadvantaged. Special education funding, we would return to a 6 category with multipliers, a 6 category type arrangement. And Lorna, I know you'll appreciate this. The catastrophic funding for those students who require an education, who might cost a district, a single student, $50,000, $60,000, $90,000. We would increase that funding to 100%, with the local district getting 90% based on its state share index. And the final 10% would be set aside to cover these catastrophic costs. Gifted education is factored into this. There's a formula that we use for that. It's based on research for the Ohio Department of Education. English language learners, we have some school districts. Here's how complex it is, guys. There's a district, Lakewood on the west side of Cleveland, 30 different languages spoken. Dakota, just north of Cincinnati, 50 different languages spoken, and that doesn't include the dialects. So we know that there's more cost to educating these students as well, and we would be using some research to determine how much more those costs would be. There's a whole notion with career tech that needs to be addressed, and it is in this particular bill. I'm trying to wrap up here to be cognizant of your time. We already talked about direct funding of charter schools, and they would, just to give you an idea, they would get the 60% here full for the district classroom instruction, and then in the instructional supports, 90% of that, 90% of building leadership, and 90% of district leadership. So their average share would come in at about, and let me get this straight, 6,800, and the typical public school student, it would be about $7,200 under HB 305, $7,200 for a typical kid before the add-ons. And finally, yes.
Question.
John?
Gallo
Yes.
has a question. Wait a minute, let Gallo go first.
Oh, thanks. I just had a couple of clarifying questions I was hoping that you could help out with. And I think this might require the help of some of the team members here. But if, as an example, if you had a student, first of all, does anyone know how much it costs to go to St. John annually?
It's different, Gallo, depending on if it's a K through 8 or 9 through 12. And John, correct me if I'm wrong, but a voucher will go with them to provide some all of the cost of that.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I was wondering how much does it cost to go to St. John, and then how much if a parent was using the Ed Choice or using that model,
Yeah.
how much of the cost would be picked up for the Ed Choice to go to St. John? And I'm just using this as an example because it's local, and I was hoping that folks might know what the numbers were.
I can't speak for St. John. I don't know what their tuition is, but up to that 6,800 that I just mentioned would be funded by the state.
Okay.
And that, I can tell you, is about, we figured it out, close to 300 million without a voucher expansion.
And so is HB 305 hoping to take up some of that or change that, or is HB 305 just separate altogether?
Oh, no, no, no. It addresses that. Remember when I was talking about deducts?
Yes.
First part of our conversation, it's addressed in 305, that the state would fund St. John kids directly and it wouldn't go through the local school anymore.
Okay. And then last question. On the website, on the Ohio Legislator website, it says that the update is still in 2019. So I'm sorry if I missed it, but where are you with the HB 305 right now?
That is an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked. My joint sponsor originally was Representative Cupp. He is now Speaker Cupp, and that gives us more muscle at the table. So since he's been Speaker, this is one of his priorities, is to get this bill through. I now have a new joint sponsor who is the Vice Chair of the Finance Committee. We have tweaked the formula a little bit to make sure that it meets what the speaker wants it to do. It looks like the subcommittee from the primary, secondary will be expanded so that we can start informal hearings as early as next week.
Hmm.
And then the formal bill would be accepted in full finance committee, which is 33 members, when it next meets, which won't be until after the election. But by having the subcommittee meet, we'll have it prepared for them so it will go quickly through finance. Once it goes through finance, once the finance committee signs off and we get a vote out of there, it can go to the floor the next day. That same process, we're moving in a same way in the Senate, so that it's going to move on parallel tracks, because we have to get it to the governor's desk before the middle part of December during lame duck for him to sign. Otherwise, if it doesn't make it, it has to start all over again, and I will be watching the proceedings
On the
from
sideline.
back home.
I just looked up the St. John's tuition, K through 8. It's 5,000, approximately 5,000 if you're a parishioner, 6,000 if you're not. 9 through 12 is 8 to 9,000, but it does talk about the ed choice and stuff that you can. I didn't see how much that was going to be, so that's approximate, depending on whether you're Catholic or not, you don't go to a Catholic church or not. So my question, John, is if this passes, but there's no money, what good's it going to do, I guess, is my question.
Oh, it's another excellent question. There will be some money, Mary, because there's a pot that would just be, as opposed to operating the way it is now. I think we spend roughly a little over $7 billion now. This package would cost almost $9 billion, fully funded. So you would just drop in the money that would have gone into it to begin to phase it in. It wouldn't be fully phased in for 6 years. Make sense?
Do you have a question, Lorna?
Oh, I did. John, concerning the money that's going to follow these kids that go to charter and private schools, will they be held accountable? I'm losing the word.
No, that's the word.
You know
Use it.
what I mean?
I do. Right now, they're not. But
No.
it would be my hope that because it's public dollars,
Yes.
as we are held accountable in the public schools for that,
Mhm.
sooner or later the accountability will follow, and that's good for everybody.
But there's nothing in 305
No,
concerning
we
that.
could. That's a bridge too far, sadly. This is just a pure school funding bill, and that's about all I could chew on at this point to get help to get it passed. Keep in mind, I reside in the deep minority. And it's amazing when minority members' bills are passed in the first place, let alone something of this magnitude.
Are there any other questions? It's 8:30. We could go on, I'm sure, but
I'm ready to go on, Mary.
I'm sure you are, John, but I don't know about how much anybody else wants to go on. Are there any other questions? I'm sure we all completely understand this now. John did send me a copy of the bill about a month ago when we were talking about it, and I just scanned down through multiple pages and said, okay, this is totally beyond me. So we certainly appreciate the overview you've given us. It's well needed, been needed for, I can't believe how many years it's been needed.
23, but who's counting?
That's right, that's right. Does
Hey,
this basically answer the DeWolf problem or not?
Yes.
Good.
And keep in mind, Bob Cupp was a member of the Supreme Court at one time.
Mhm.
He's a legal eagle, and he has said on many occasions it does meet the DeRolf directives.
Good, good.
I just wanted to mention real quick, I did drop some links throughout the presentation that could help, including the Euler model, direct link to the HB 305, and the fair school funding link that Dr. Patterson had mentioned, as well as some information on the tuition rates for St. John's. So that will come up for any recording too for folks.
Yeah. And the St. John's too, if there's scholarships, if you help on fundraising, you get a discount. So there's all kinds of things to discount on that. But
One point I'd like to make too is St. John's has seen a big uptick in enrollment because they are in school, whereas some of the other school districts are not. And, you know, parents are concerned about daycare and those kinds of issues.
well, if there are no other questions, I certainly want to thank John and, for attending. And like I said before, I'm certainly glad he can do this from Columbus and not have to drive up here. It would have been very difficult to schedule, I'm sure, with everything going on. When is the legislature, do you have another vacation? That's not the word, recess coming up, or are you pretty much working through December now?
We're in session tomorrow, and I'm told that's the last session day until after the election. But the primary secondary subcommittee will be meeting 2 or 3 days a week. My hope over the next 4-5 weeks to get it ready for the full finance. So I will still be working for you.
But it won't go up to vote until sometime in November then.
At the earliest, right.
And hopefully it'll be done by mid-December.
It has to be, because right now there is no formula, and God help the next legislators coming in to figure this out.
Right.
It's so complex, very few, how can I say this diplomatically? Nancy would probably have a different way of describing it. Some are not as mentally possessed to go this deep into the weeds as Speaker Cupp and I have been in order to get the information we've needed to put together all the pieces.
Are many of the people that you feel are in your camp going to be not coming back?
That's another, you're right, that's another concern. There will be, because of, hey there, how you doing?
How you doing?
They're cleaning my office now. So there will be turnover, and that's a concern. There is also concern, admittedly, that there might be a coup to remove Speaker Cupp, and concerned about that for the next GA. There will be a new president of the Senate. Right now, the local boy, Larry Obhoff, is the president, whose mother, of course, was a public school teacher. So the stars are aligning right, and we just have to get this done now.
Is there anything we can do, either as a league or personally?
Well, I'm trying to think. Mike O'Brien in Southern Ashtabula County supports this. Senator O'Brien of the 32nd District supports this. But if we have Geauga County friends on the line, they might run this by, or Lake County Representative Callender, Senator Eklund, Representative Grindell, reach out to their office and voice your, thanks buddy, take care now, and voice your support for this.
Okay.
Or other legislators. I know it'd be helpful, Senator Dolan out of Cleveland. He's chair of Senate Finance. Or reach out to Senator Obhoff in particular. But it's time to reach out to our reps and our senators around the state and ask them to support this. But I need your help to do that.
Okay.
Hey, Mary, will the League of Women Voters weigh in on this officially then, the statewide organization?
If it's something we've studied, and we should have, I don't know. I can't remember what the state position is on it. Probably, because I know we've talked about it for years. I'll check with that. I'll contact the state and see.
Do that, and if they would like a private audience, I'll meet with them.
Okay.
And I want to thank you for this time. It's always a thrill to get together with folks who have a passion for school funding and doing what's right for our kids and our future.
Well, we thank you for all the work you've done. Okay, well, thank you all for attending and,
Yeah. Thanks for your time, John.
yep.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much.
Good to see you.
And we'll encourage you all to, you can watch this again or to be sure and come in for the candidates nights next week on Tuesday and Wednesday. So thank you all and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.